Case 1, Kenneth Erskine. July 28, 1987. Stockwell, London, England. On April 9, 1986, inside a ground-floor flat in Wandsworth, 78-year-old Eileen Emps was found lying in her bed with no immediate signs of disturbance, and her death was initially considered consistent with natural causes due to her age and the absence of visible trauma. A subsequent post-mortem examination documented manual strangulation along with medical evidence of sexual assault, establishing that the apparently peaceful scene had concealed a deliberate homicide carried out with controlled pressure to the neck and upper chest. What investigators would later determine was that this same combination of manual strangulation, chest compression injuries, and minimal forced entry would appear repeatedly across several elderly deaths, while palm prints and trace evidence ultimately linked the cases to a single offender later identified as Kenneth Erskine. Kenneth Erskine, born in 1962 in England, was documented as a transient individual who moved between special schools, hostels, and temporary accommodations throughout his youth and early adulthood. Police records show repeated arrests for burglary and theft across London, and financial documents later revealed he maintained multiple accounts containing proceeds from stolen property. Court psychiatrists evaluated Erskine before trial and concluded he functioned with significantly reduced cognitive capacity, describing him as possessing a mental age comparable to approximately 11 to 12 years. Psychological reports also documented behavioral instability, including violent outbursts and difficulty distinguishing reality from imagined experiences. The victims were elderly residents living alone or in assisted housing, including Eileen Emps, 78, Janet Cockett, 67, Valentine Gleam, 84, Zbigniew Strabowa, 94, William Carmen, 84, William Downs, 74, and Florence Tisdall, 83. Most were pensioners known locally as quiet individuals who maintained predictable daily routines. Janet Cockett, age 67, was found dead on June 9, 1986, in her Stockwell flat. Investigators documented entry likely through an unsecured window and recovered a palm print from a displaced object. At the time, the print could not immediately be matched, leaving the case without a confirmed suspect. On June 28, 1986, two elderly residents of a Stockwell care facility, Valentine Gleam, 84, and Zbigniew Strabowa, 94, were discovered dead in adjacent rooms. Medical examiners documented manual strangulation in both cases along with evidence of sexual assault. Injury patterns indicated sustained pressure applied to the neck while body weight compressed the chest to restrict movement and breathing. The fifth victim, William Carmen, 84, was killed on July 8, 1986, in his Islington flat. Investigative records noted missing cash from the residence. Forensic examination again confirmed manual strangulation and post-mortem positioning beneath bed sheets, a behavioral signature repeated across multiple scenes. On July 21, 1986, 74-year-old William Downs was found dead in a Stockwell bedsit. Investigators recovered a clear palm print from the kitchen wall. Because palm print records were not fully computerized at the time, comparison required manual review of extensive criminal files. The final confirmed victim, Florence Tisdall, an 83-year-old widow living in a retirement complex in Fulham, was found dead on July 23, 1986. Autopsy findings documented manual strangulation and rib fractures consistent with sustained downward pressure applied to the chest during the assault. In several cases, medical examiners also recorded sexual interference but could not determine whether it occurred before or after death due to postmortem changes. Investigators documented multiple categories of physical evidence, including palm prints, fingerprints on displaced items, a single hair recovered from bedding, and shoe impressions present at several scenes. The absence of significant struggle marks indicated that most victims were attacked while asleep or physically overpowered within seconds. Together, these findings demonstrated a consistent offender using a controlled and repetitive method. The forensic turning point occurred when palm prints recovered from separate crime scenes were compared against burglary records and matched to Kenneth Erskine. This scientific linkage contradicted earlier assumptions that the deaths were unrelated and instead demonstrated a connected series of homicides targeting elderly residents. Official medical conclusions across the cases consistently listed cause of death as manual strangulation with associated compressive chest injuries. Time of death estimates aligned with nighttime intrusions, explaining the minimal disturbance documented in several bedrooms. The investigation expanded as Scotland Yard assigned large numbers of detectives and established surveillance at residential homes housing elderly residents. Evidence logs confirmed repeated entry through unsecured windows rather than forced doors, suggesting the offender relied on opportunity and vulnerability rather than confrontation. Kenneth Erskine was arrested on July 28, 1987, at a Social Security office after investigators determined he regularly collected benefits there. Laboratory comparison confirmed his palm print matched impressions recovered from a murder scene. A surviving victim of an attempted strangulation, Frederick Prentice, identified Erskine during an identity parade, providing corroborative testimony. During questioning, Erskine reportedly stated, "I don't remember killing anyone. I could have done it without knowing it. I am not sure if I did." Investigative notes also recorded erratic behavior and limited engagement, reinforcing psychiatric concerns regarding his mental condition. Financial analysis showed deposits totaling approximately £3,000 during the period of the murders, including funds shortly after one victim known to keep cash at home was killed. Erskine was formally charged with 7 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Under English law, a murder conviction required proof that he intentionally caused death with unlawful malice aforethought. His trial opened at the Old Bailey on January 12, 1988. The prosecution presented palm print evidence, witness identification, financial records, and forensic testimony, describing the consistent method of manual strangulation. Expert witnesses explained that sustained compression of the neck can cause unconsciousness within approximately 30 seconds in elderly individuals and death within several minutes due to oxygen deprivation. The defense emphasized documented mental disorder and reduced cognitive functioning. Despite pleading not guilty, the jury convicted him on all counts on January 29, 1988. He received 7 life sentences with an additional term for attempted murder, with a recommended minimum of 40 years before parole consideration. In July 2009, following appeal, the murder convictions were reduced to manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility under the Mental Health Act 1983, reflecting psychiatric findings that significantly impaired his responsibility at the time of the offenses. He is currently detained at the maximum security Broadmoor Hospital and is considered unlikely to be released before at least 2028. The victims were elderly pensioners living independently or in supported housing, and contemporary reports documented widespread fear among older residents in South London, prompting increased patrols and protective measures in residential facilities. Families described their relatives as quiet individuals whose routines made them particularly vulnerable to nighttime intrusion. The forensic evidence established a consistent pattern of manual strangulation, chest compression injuries, and repeated behavioral signatures linking 7 confirmed deaths. The evidence failed to determine the precise timing of sexual assaults and did not conclusively connect Erskine to several additional suspected murders. Because some early deaths were initially classified as natural causes, critical trace evidence was limited. The unresolved question remains whether additional elderly deaths during that period shared the same undetected forensic pattern. Kenneth Erskine remains confined within Broadmoor under secure psychiatric detention following convictions later reduced to manslaughter due to diminished responsibility. Before we continue, welcome to Crime Pioneer channel. If you enjoy true crime videos, this is the right channel for you. I post interesting videos on the channel regularly. Please support my channel by liking this video and subscribing. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Thank you very much. Number 2. Stephen John Griffiths. March 11, 1994. Sunderland, Tyne and Wear, England. On November 26, 1993, firefighters responding to a blaze at an allotment shed behind Monkwearmouth Hospital discovered the body of 18-year-old Thomas Kelly, with extensive burn damage initially obscuring visible injuries and complicating immediate determination of the cause of death. Subsequent forensic examination documented compression injuries to the neck consistent with manual strangulation. establishing that the fire had been deliberately set after death in an apparent attempt to destroy biological and trace evidence. What investigators did not initially realize was that the same combination of strangulation indicators and post-mortem fire damage would appear in later deaths of teenage boys across Sunderland, revealing a linked pattern attributed to Stephen John Griffiths. Stephen John Griffiths was born in 1970 and lived in Sunderland, Tyne and Wear. Employment records describe him as having worked as a fairground laborer and later as a kitchen assistant, with intermittent periods of unemployment during the early 1990s. Police files show he had previously been interviewed in connection with local incidents but had no homicide convictions at that time. During court proceedings, prosecutors stated that Griffiths targeted teenage boys and young men and that his stated motive involved preventing victims from revealing sexual contact, a claim derived from his later admissions during police interviews. Psychiatric testimony presented at trial described him as displaying psychopathic personality traits, including emotional detachment and limited empathy, which experts characterized as increasing the risk of repeated violent behavior when combined with impulsivity. The victims were Thomas Kelly, 18, David Hanson, 15, David Grief, 15, and Simon Martin, 14. All were teenage boys living in Sunderland who were last seen engaged in routine daily activities before their disappearances. On May 18, 1990, 14-year-old Simon Martin was last seen alive at approximately 5 p.m. after leaving to play with friends, and when he failed to return home by 6 p.m., his family reported him missing that evening. His body was discovered on May 26 inside a derelict building at Gilside House in Roker. Post-mortem findings documented a fatal brain injury with compression of the neck identified as a contributing factor. Later forensic testing conducted in 2000 identified semen linked to Griffiths through DNA profiling, a scientific method comparing genetic markers to establish the source of biological material. On November 26, 1993, Thomas Kelly's body was found burning in the allotment shed. Detailed examination determined he had been strangled before the fire was ignited, demonstrating that the burning was a post-mortem concealment measure rather than the primary cause of death. On February 8, 1994, 15-year-old David Hanson's remains were discovered in a derelict house in Roker after firefighters responded to another blaze. Medical examiners documented neck injuries consistent with strangulation, though heat exposure had degraded potential trace evidence. On February 25, 1994, 15-year-old David Grief was found dead in an allotment shed near Monkwearmouth Hospital. Autopsy findings again indicated manual strangulation prior to the body being burned, reinforcing a repeated behavioral and forensic pattern. Investigators documented 3 primary categories of physical evidence: pattern neck bruising consistent with sustained manual pressure, burn patterns indicating deliberate ignition after death, and later DNA evidence linking Griffiths to Simon Martin. Together, these findings demonstrated intentional homicide followed by attempts to destroy forensic traces. The forensic turning point occurred when Griffiths' later admissions aligned with preserved medical findings from earlier scenes, contradicting his previous denials that the deaths were accidental or unrelated incidents. Official determinations listed the causes of death for the later victims as strangulation, with fire damage classified as post-mortem concealment. In Simon Martin's case, the cause of death was recorded as brain injury with neck compression contributing. Some physical evidence was permanently compromised by fire, limiting recovery of biological material and delaying definitive linkage between the cases during early investigative stages. Police intensified the inquiry after repeated deaths involving teenage males in similar circumstances. Investigators reviewed prior interviews and witness statements, including reports that Griffiths had been seen with victims shortly before their disappearances. Griffiths was arrested on March 11, 1994, following the expanded investigation. Court testimony later established that he had previously been questioned but had not disclosed his involvement at that time. During later interviews, he stated that the deaths occurred after he became fearful that victims would reveal sexual contact. In statements regarding Simon Martin, he admitted strangling him after becoming panicked, though he later claimed the death was unintended. Laboratory testing confirmed DNA evidence linking him to Simon Martin, while the other cases relied primarily on consistent injury patterns and circumstantial linkage because fire damage had reduced available trace evidence. Investigative records also show that at one stage another individual was charged in relation to Simon Martin's death, before the case was dropped due to insufficient evidence. Stephen John Griffiths was formally charged with multiple counts of murder. Under English criminal law, a murder conviction requires proof that the defendant intentionally caused death or serious injury leading to death. A 6-week trial concluded on February 28, 1996. The prosecution presented forensic pathology findings, fire scene analysis, and statements attributed to Griffiths. Despite earlier denials, he was convicted of the murders of Thomas Kelly, David Hansen, and David Grief and received 3 life sentences with a recommended minimum term of 35 years. In November 2000, while serving those sentences, he was questioned regarding Simon Martin's death. On November 22, 2012, he was formally charged, and on October 24, 2013, following trial at Newcastle Crown Court, he was convicted of Simon Martin's murder after admitting responsibility but denying intent. The court rejected diminished responsibility arguments and confirmed a sentence requiring at least 35 years imprisonment. He remains incarcerated. The victims were described by their families as ordinary teenagers with active social lives. Simon Martin lived with his parents, Robert and Jean, and had been expected home for tea on the evening he disappeared. Families of the other victims attended proceedings and documented long-term trauma resulting from the delayed resolution of the cases. Community response in Sunderland included sustained media coverage, public appeals, and family vigils during court hearings. Relatives expressed relief following the later conviction but continued to question how earlier deaths were not immediately recognized as connected. The forensic evidence established that multiple victims died from strangulation and that fire was used in several cases to obscure biological traces. The evidence failed to preserve complete material from burned scenes and initially failed to confirm homicide in at least one case. Because early examinations were hindered by fire damage and delayed pattern recognition, a critical question remains. How many investigative opportunities were lost when key forensic indicators were partially destroyed before linkage between the cases was established? Stephen John Griffiths remains incarcerated under life sentences with a minimum term of 35 years for the murders of 4 teenage boys in Sunderland. Number 3. Stephen Sean Griffiths. May 24, 2010, Bradford, West Yorkshire, England. Forensic investigators reviewing multiple disappearances of female sex workers in Bradford between 2009 and 2010 documented a consistent evidentiary pattern. Sharp force injuries and crossbow trauma combined with post-mortem dismemberment, a process in which a body is deliberately cut into sections to hinder identification and evidence recovery. This pattern became critical because early cases were initially treated as separate missing person investigations rather than linked homicides, delaying coordinated forensic analysis across scenes. What investigators did not initially realize was that CCTV footage, river recovery evidence, and biological traces from a single flat would later demonstrate a connected series of killings committed by Stephen Sean Griffiths. Stephen Sean Griffiths was born on December 24, 1969, in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, and later lived in Bradford, where records show he studied criminology while residing in a flat on Thornton Road for more than a decade. Employment history was limited, and neighbors described him as socially isolated with unusual behavior. His criminal history included a 3-year sentence at age 17 for an unprovoked knife attack on a supermarket manager. In 1991, he was diagnosed as a schizoid psychopath, and the following year he received a 2-year sentence for holding a knife to a girl's throat. Psychiatrists later testified that he had long-standing fantasies about becoming a serial killer, and investigators documented that police had monitored him 2 years before the murders, even seizing hunting weapons due to concern about escalating risk. The victims were Susan Rushworth, 43, Shelley Armitage, 31, and Suzanne Blamires, 36, women working in Bradford street sex trade, a population documented by police as operating in poorly monitored industrial areas. Susan Rushworth was reported missing after she disappeared on June 22, 2009. No remains have ever been recovered, creating a permanent evidentiary gap that limited direct forensic reconstruction of her death. Shelley Armitage, 31, was last seen on April 26, 2010. Weeks later, human tissue recovered from the River Aire was forensically identified as belonging to her through laboratory comparison of biological material. Suzanne Blamires, 36, was last seen alive in the early hours of May 22, 2010. Later that day, her boyfriend contacted family after several days without contact, prompting a missing person investigation. On May 25, 2010, parts of Blamires's body were recovered from the River Aire near Shipley. Forensic examination confirmed dismemberment and injuries consistent with crossbow use, a weapon that propels bolts using stored mechanical energy rather than gunpowder. Investigators documented 3 primary categories of physical evidence: CCTV footage from Griffiths' residential building, recovered body fragments from the river, and biological traces located inside his flat. Together, these findings demonstrated that the victims had been attacked inside the residence before remains were disposed of in nearby waterways. The most significant evidentiary moment occurred when a building caretaker reviewing security footage observed a woman later identified as Blamires fleeing a flat, followed by a man who restrained her and used a crossbow. This visual record contradicted any possibility that her disappearance was voluntary. Additional footage showed the suspect returning to the camera holding the weapon and later leaving with bags consistent with the movement of remains, establishing a documented post-incident sequence. Official determinations concluded that the murders involved stabbing and crossbow injuries followed by dismemberment, with disposal of remains intended to prevent identification and destroy forensic evidence. In Susan Rushworth's case, the absence of remains prevented full medical determination of cause of death, demonstrating how body disposal can permanently limit forensic conclusions. The investigation intensified immediately after the CCTV discovery. Armed officers entered the building and arrested Griffiths on May 24, 2010, after detectives reviewed the footage and identified him as the resident of the flat. Laboratory testing on recovered body parts confirmed that some remains belonged to Blamires and others to Armitage. Evidence logs also recorded blood traces inside the flat associated with the missing women. During arrest and questioning, Griffiths made statements to officers including, "I've killed loads," though investigators noted no evidence at that stage linking him to additional confirmed murders beyond the 3 victims. Police records show that Griffiths had lived in the building for approximately 15 years, allowing investigators to reconstruct movement patterns and establish opportunity across the timeline of the disappearances. Stephen Sean Griffiths was formally charged with 3 counts of murder. Under English law, murder requires proof that the defendant intentionally caused death or serious injury leading to death. Court proceedings documented that he admitted killing Suzanne Blamires, Shelley Armitage, and Susan Rushworth. On December 21, 2010, after pleading guilty, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The presiding judge stated that the circumstances of the killings were wicked and monstrous, and concluded that Griffiths should remain in prison for the rest of his life, indicating a whole life sentence. Prosecutor Robert Smith QC told the court that CCTV footage showed Blamires being pursued and dragged, while additional evidence included disturbing video recordings recovered from Griffiths' possession. Police also confirmed that they had no evidence linking him to other specific murders, though multiple forces reviewed unsolved cases for possible connections. The victims were described by families as loved daughters and mothers. Suzanne Blamires' mother stated she thought of her bright, articulate daughter every day, while Shelley Armitage's family said her death would haunt them permanently. Susan Rushworth's relatives publicly appealed for information about the location of her remains. Community response in Bradford included large-scale search operations of rivers, derelict buildings, and industrial sites. Detectives acknowledged that street sex workers operate in areas with limited surveillance, increasing vulnerability to predatory offenders. The case also prompted renewed discussion among policing authorities about databases tracking offenders who target sex workers and the role of CCTV networks in identifying violent crime patterns. The forensic evidence established that Griffiths murdered 3 women using knives and a crossbow, dismembered their bodies, and disposed of remains in the River Aire. The evidence failed to recover any remains of Susan Rushworth and could not determine the full sequence of injuries in her case. Because early disappearances were treated separately and key biological evidence was destroyed through dismemberment and water exposure, a critical question remains. How many investigative opportunities are lost when vulnerable victims disappear without immediate forensic linkage between cases? Stephen Sean Griffiths remains incarcerated under a life sentence for the murders of Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamires. If you found this video interesting so far, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for your support. Number 4. Dale Christopher Cregan. September 18, 2012, Greater Manchester, England. Forensic investigators examining the series of shootings in Greater Manchester during 2012 documented a consistent ballistic pattern. Multiple firearm discharges at close range, followed in 2 incidents by the deployment of military-style hand grenades intended to cause additional blast trauma and obstruct emergency response. This pattern became critical because the early shooting of Mark Short inside a public house was initially treated as a targeted gang-related attack rather than the beginning of a wider sequence of retaliatory killings. What investigators did not initially realize was that ballistic evidence, threat-to-life warnings, and later admissions would demonstrate a connected escalation involving Dale Christopher Cregan that culminated in the deliberate killing of 2 responding police officers. Dale Christopher Cregan was born on June 6, 1983, at Tameside General Hospital in Greater Manchester and grew up in a terraced house in Droylsden with an older brother, younger sister, and later his own son. School records show he attended Littlemoss High School before entering local drug distribution networks. Criminal intelligence indicated he initially dealt cannabis and, by his early 20s, had transitioned into cocaine trafficking while maintaining an official occupation listed as plasterer. Associates described him as a physically imposing hard man with access to multiple firearms. His earlier history included repeated violent confrontations, and police sources believed his missing left eye had been forcefully removed by other gang members, contradicting his claim that the injury occurred during a fight abroad. Psychological commentary presented in court later suggested traits consistent with psychopathy, including grandiosity and diminished empathy. The first homicide occurred on May 25, 2012, when 23-year-old Mark Short was shot inside the Cotton Tree Pub in Droylsden. Witness testimony confirmed that 3 additional men were also targeted in the same incident, forming the basis for 3 separate attempted murder charges. According to investigative records, the shooting took place during an ongoing feud involving rival associates, though the exact trigger event remained disputed. The ballistic evidence indicated intentional close-range firing designed to ensure fatal injury. On August 10, 2012, Mark's father, 46-year-old David Short, was attacked outside his home in Clayton. Forensic examination documented multiple gunshot wounds followed by the detonation of a hand grenade thrown toward his body, an explosive device designed to produce high-velocity fragmentation. Greater Manchester Police had previously issued David Short 3 formal threat-to-life warnings, indicating intelligence that his safety was at significant risk. Despite these warnings, the attack occurred as he unloaded his vehicle. The forensic sequence suggested a retaliatory motive. Ballistic evidence indicated controlled targeting, while the grenade deployment demonstrated an escalation intended to intimidate rivals and complicate evidence recovery. By September 2012, Cregan was on the run. On September 18th, he placed a hoax emergency call reporting a burglary at Abbey Gardens in Hattersley. Constables Nicola Hughes, 23, and Fiona Bone, 32, were dispatched to the address. As the officers approached the property, Cregan opened the door and fired repeatedly with a handgun. Court testimony established that 32 shots were discharged in approximately 31 seconds. Both officers were struck multiple times. Evidence logs indicated that each officer sustained numerous ballistic injuries before a military grenade was thrown onto the path where they lay, creating additional blast and fragmentation risk for responders. This sequence represented the forensic turning point. The staged emergency call demonstrated premeditation, defined in law as planning a killing in advance rather than acting impulsively. After the attack, Cregan walked into a nearby police station and stated that he had dropped the weapon and had murdered 2 police officers, an admission later presented in court proceedings. Investigators documented 3 key evidentiary categories. First, ballistic analysis confirming weapon discharge patterns. Second, explosive residue consistent with grenade deployment. Third, admissions made during custody. Together, these established intentional homicide across all incidents. The investigation involved extensive armed policing operations due to the risk posed by a suspect known to possess multiple weapons. Greater Manchester Police coordinated searches across several locations while monitoring associates linked to the earlier feud. Court testimony established that after the first killing, Cregan had been arrested on suspicion but later released on bail, a procedural decision that became heavily scrutinized after subsequent murders. Following the deaths of the police officers, a national manhunt identified him as one of the most wanted fugitives in the United Kingdom. He ultimately surrendered on September 18, 2012, shortly after the final attack. Dale Christopher Cregan was formally charged with 4 counts of murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. Under English law, murder requires proof that the defendant intentionally caused death or serious injury leading to death. The trial began on February 4, 2013, at Preston Crown Court under extraordinary security measures that included armed officers, sniper observation positions, and a guarded daily convoy transporting the defendant between facilities. During proceedings, Cregan admitted responsibility for the murders of Mark Short, David Short, Nicola Hughes, and Fiona Bone. Evidence presented included ballistic reports, threat intelligence records, and testimony describing the staged emergency call. Mr. Justice Holroyd stated during sentencing that the killings were carried out with premeditated savagery and concluded that the defendant had deliberately lured unarmed officers to the scene. On June 13, 2013, Cregan was convicted of all 4 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he will spend the remainder of his life in custody without the possibility of release. Post-trial records noted that he later engaged in a hunger strike and was transferred to Ashworth Hospital in September 2013 for further management while remaining under a whole life sentence. The victims were described by families and colleagues as deeply valued members of their communities. Nicola Hughes's father stated their lives had been shattered beyond belief, while Fiona Bone's family said not a day passed without thinking of her. Mark Short died in the presence of his father, and David Short was killed months later, leaving relatives to confront the loss of both a son and a parent within a single escalating conflict. Community response across Greater Manchester included memorial services for the 2 constables and renewed discussion about the risks faced by officers responding to emergency calls without prior intelligence. The forensic evidence established that Cregan carried out 4 intentional shootings and used grenades in 2 incidents, demonstrating a clear escalation in both lethality and planning. The evidence also confirmed that the final attack was triggered through a deliberate hoax designed to draw police to the location. However, the earlier release on bail after the first killing and the existence of prior threat warnings raised unresolved procedural questions about risk assessment. When intelligence identifies escalating violence, what threshold should trigger continuous containment of a suspect capable of rapid retaliatory attacks? Dale Christopher Cregan remains incarcerated under a whole life order for the murders of Mark Short, David Short, Nicola Hughes, and Fiona Bone. Number 5. John Francis Duffy. December 29, 1985. Hackney Wick, East London, England. On the evening of December 29, 1985, 19-year-old Alison Day stepped off a train at Hackney Wick to meet her fiancé and never arrived. When her body was recovered from the River Lea on January 15, 1986, forensic pathologists documented ligature strangulation using fabric torn from her own clothing, indicating sustained compression of the neck that would have rapidly reduced oxygen supply to the brain. This finding became critical because earlier railway station attacks across North and West London had been investigated primarily as sexual offenses without confirmed homicide linkage. The presence of bindings, gagging, and controlled restraint suggested a deliberate, repeatable method rather than a spontaneous assault. What investigators did not initially realize was that fiber evidence, consistent restraint patterns, and the geographic clustering along railway routes would later demonstrate a connected series of offenses involving more than one offender. John Francis Duffy, born in 1956, later worked as a carpenter for British Rail, a job that provided detailed familiarity with rail lines, maintenance paths, and poorly lit access routes across North and West London. Records indicated he practiced martial arts and had prior police involvement following a conviction related to sexual violence against his wife. Beginning in 1982, police documented a series of sexual assaults near railway stations, including the rape of a woman near Hampstead, followed by numerous similar attacks through 1983 and 1984. Additional assaults continued into 1985, prompting the creation of a major inquiry known as Operation Heart, which linked incidents through location, restraint use, and victim selection. Investigators later consulted Professor David Cantor of the University of Surrey, who applied early psychological offender profiling, a method that analyzes crime scene behavior to infer offender traits. His assessment suggested the offender possessed railway knowledge, lived locally, and demonstrated escalating sexual aggression, characteristics consistent with Duffy's documented background. According to investigative timelines, the pattern escalated from repeated sexual assaults to confirmed homicide on December 29, 1985, when Alison Day was last seen arriving at Hackney Wick Station. No verified witnesses reported seeing her leave the immediate area, creating a critical gap in the timeline. Court evidence later established that Duffy and his associate, David Mulcahy, targeted lone women near rail corridors using concealment, knives, and restraints. Early victim statements described two attackers, but trauma and masked faces prevented reliable identification, delaying confirmation that the offenses were committed jointly. Forensic examination of Alison Day documented restraint with coarse string, gagging, and ligature strangulation created by twisting fabric into a tightening mechanism. In forensic pathology, such a configuration functions as a tourniquet ligature, increasing constriction pressure with minimal movement. The cause of death was recorded as asphyxia resulting from sustained compression of neck vessels. Environmental exposure complicated evidence recovery because the body had been placed in water, accelerating degradation of biological traces. However, fibers recovered from clothing were preserved. Fiber comparison indicated contact with the offender, while ligature pattern analysis confirmed a consistent restraint method across incidents. On April 17, 1986, 15-year-old March Tamboeser disappeared near East Horsley after cycling to purchase items before a planned holiday. Her body was found the following day in nearby woodland. Post-mortem examination documented blunt force trauma followed by ligature strangulation using her belt, indicating sequential violence progressing from incapacitation to controlled killing. Investigators also recorded an attempt to destroy evidence through fire damage to the body, behavior consistent with awareness of forensic identification techniques. Binding materials and body positioning suggested deliberate staging rather than random disposal. On May 18, 1986, 29-year-old Anne Locke, a secretary with London Weekend Television, disappeared after leaving Brookman's Park Station. Her remains were later located in undergrowth. Medical findings recorded restraint and suffocation consistent with the established attack pattern, although evidentiary degradation limited definitive attribution at the original trial. The forensic turning point occurred when investigators compared binding materials across scenes. Rope discovered at Duffy's parents' house matched material associated with one murder victim. Behavioral analysis indicated consistent victim selection, lone women near rail routes, while geographic profiling demonstrated offender familiarity with specific transit corridors. Official post-mortem reports listed the causes of death in the confirmed murders as ligature strangulation with associated sexual assault, with time of death estimates based largely on environmental indicators due to delayed discovery. Operation Heart became one of the largest coordinated manhunts in Britain at the time, linking numerous assaults through victim testimony describing two coordinated attackers. Several identity parades were inconclusive because victims remained severely traumatized and unable to provide reliable identification. Scientific evaluation later incorporated psychological profiling. Professor Cantor analyzed crime scene behavior, transport geography, and offender movement patterns, concluding the offender likely lived near the rail network and possessed practical knowledge of its layout. These findings aligned with Duffy's employment history. Duffy was arrested on November 23, 1986, after being observed following a woman in a secluded park. Searches of associated properties recovered binding fibers and materials consistent with those used in the attacks. Investigators concluded he had not acted alone, although he initially refused to identify his accomplice. Duffy's trial began in February 1988. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts including murder and rape, offenses requiring proof that the deaths resulted from intentional actions supported by forensic evidence of restraint and strangulation. The prosecution presented fiber comparisons, behavioral linkage between scenes, and expert testimony describing consistent restraint methodology and victim targeting. The defense challenged attribution in the Enlock case, citing insufficient direct physical evidence. The jury convicted Duffy of the murders of Allison Day and March Tamboeser and of 4 rapes, while acquitting him regarding Enlock's murder. He received life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 30 years. Later legal rulings removed the ability of politicians to extend tariffs, reverting his minimum term to the original period. Advances in DNA analysis, unavailable during the original investigation, later linked David Mulcahy to the offenses. In 2001, Mulcahy was convicted of 3 murders and multiple rapes and received life sentences. Both men are considered unlikely to be released. Allison Day, 19, was traveling to meet her fiancé after work when she disappeared near Hackney Wick Station. March Tamboeser, 15, was preparing for a school holiday the day she was killed. And Locke, 29, had recently married and worked in television production. Contemporary reporting documented widespread public fear regarding railway travel, particularly for women commuting alone at night. The investigation led to improved coordination between police forces covering rail jurisdictions and accelerated acceptance of psychological offender profiling as a practical investigative tool. The forensic evidence established that multiple victims were restrained and killed through ligature strangulation following sexual assault, with consistent binding materials and rail-adjacent locations indicating a repeated method. Geographic and behavioral analysis confirmed a coordinated offender pattern. However, early investigations failed to identify the second perpetrator and lacked sufficient evidence to secure a conviction for Enlock's murder at the original trial. Only later DNA testing clarified the accomplice's role. The unresolved question remains: if shared forensic evidence and behavioral linkage had been integrated across jurisdictions earlier, could the escalation from repeated assaults to homicide have been interrupted sooner? John Francis Duffy remains incarcerated under life sentences, and David Mulcahy is also serving life terms for related murders and rapes. If you're still watching, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crime Pioneer. Your support helps me bring you more true crime content. Number 6. John William Cooper. December 22, 1985, Scuffston Park, Pembrokeshire, Wales. On the evening of December 22, 1985, inside a 3-story farmhouse at Scuffston Park, the bodies of siblings Richard Thomas, 58, and Helen Thomas, 54, were later examined by forensic pathologists who documented fatal shotgun wounds followed by deliberate fire damage intended to destroy physical evidence. The pattern indicated controlled, close-range discharge consistent with intentional killing rather than accidental confrontation. This finding became critical because the initial scene was heavily compromised by fire, limiting early recovery of trace evidence and delaying confirmation that the deaths were linked to later offenses in the same rural region. What investigators did not initially realize was that ballistic characteristics, geographic clustering, and later DNA findings would connect this double homicide to a second double murder in 1989, demonstrating a single offender operating across multiple years. John William Cooper was born on September 3, 1944, and lived for many years in rural Pembrokeshire near Milford Haven. Records presented in court showed he worked in various manual trades, including farm labor, and developed extensive familiarity with local fields, coastal paths, and isolated properties within a small geographic radius. Investigative files documented a long history of criminal activity, including approximately 30 burglaries, violent robbery, and offenses involving firearms. By the late 1980s, he had become known to police as a persistent offender targeting rural homes for financial gain, often operating at night and using a shotgun to threaten occupants. Psychological and behavioral assessments presented during the investigation suggested a pattern of escalating offending, moving from burglary to armed robbery and eventually to lethal violence. Officials later stated that his crimes demonstrated planning, knowledge of terrain, and a willingness to use controlled force to eliminate witnesses. On December 22, 1985, Cooper targeted the Scuffston Park farmhouse believed to contain valuables. Court testimony indicated he may have expected the property to be empty. Instead, Helen Thomas was present inside. The evidence suggested she recognized the intruder or his voice, prompting the offender to fire a shotgun at close range. A short time later, Richard Thomas returned to the property and was also shot. Forensic examination documented multiple shotgun injuries consistent with discharge from a smoothbore firearm at relatively short distance, producing pellet spread patterns used in later ballistic comparison. After the shootings, diesel was poured inside the house and the building was set alight, a method consistent with attempted destruction of trace evidence. For several years, the case remained unresolved due to limited recoverable forensic material. The pattern of rural targeting, however, remained documented in investigative files. On June 29, 1989, holidaymakers Peter Dixon, 51, and Gwenda Dixon, 52, were last seen leaving their tent near the Pembrokeshire coastal path. When they failed to return, a search was initiated. Their bodies were later found concealed in undergrowth near the path. Post-mortem examinations recorded close-range shotgun wounds as the cause of death. Evidence indicated Peter Dixon's hands had been tied behind his back, demonstrating restraint prior to shooting. Investigators also determined that the offender forced disclosure of the victim's bank card PIN and withdrew approximately £350, establishing robbery as a motive component. The forensic turning point emerged years later when ballistic review and trace evidence were compared across both crime scenes. The offenses shared three consistent elements: use of a shotgun, rural isolation, and controlled restraint or immobilization of victims before fatal discharge. Together, these patterns suggested a single offender familiar with the terrain. Additional linkage evidence included the later recovery of items belonging to victims among property associated with Cooper, indicating retention of stolen material rather than immediate disposal. Early investigations involved large-scale searches, with approximately 150 officers engaged following the 1985 farmhouse murders. Despite strong suspicion within the community, detectives lacked physical evidence capable of placing a suspect at the scenes. In 1998, Cooper was imprisoned for burglary and armed robbery. During that period, investigators preserved items recovered from his home and related locations, anticipating future forensic testing as technology improved. A major cold case review, later known as Operation Ottawa, re-examined evidence from the 1985 and 1989 murders alongside the 1996 armed robbery and sexual assault of teenagers in Woodland near Milford Haven. Forensic scientists conducted detailed testing on clothing, a balaclava, gloves, and a double-barreled shotgun. Laboratory analysis identified Peter Dixon's DNA on clothing retained by Cooper and detected a trace of Dixon's blood beneath later paint on the shotgun. Fiber comparisons and property linkage connected items from multiple scenes. Investigative records describe this combination as the forensic golden nugget required to present a prosecutable case. Following these findings, Cooper was arrested on May 13, 2009, shortly after his release from prison. Cooper was formally charged with 4 counts of murder, along with rape, sexual assault, and attempted robbery offenses. Under UK law, murder requires proof that the defendant intentionally caused death through actions likely to result in fatal injury, supported in this case by ballistic, DNA, and property evidence. The trial at Swansea Crown Court lasted several weeks. The prosecution presented ballistic comparisons, DNA results, and evidence that stolen items, including clothing and personal property, had been retained by Cooper. Footage from a 1989 appearance on the television program Bullseye was also used to compare his appearance with a suspect image connected to the Dixon investigation. The defense challenged aspects of the forensic interpretation and alleged that some evidence had been withheld. Despite these claims, the jury returned unanimous guilty verdicts. On May 26, 2011, Cooper received 4 life sentences. Sentencing remarks stated that the life term would mean imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life due to the severity and predatory nature of the offenses. In September 2011, he filed an appeal against his convictions. Unless successful, he has no realistic prospect of parole. Richard Thomas, 58, was a Pembrokeshire landowner, and his sister Helen Thomas, 54, lived at the Scufston Park property. Their deaths shocked a rural community with historically low violent crime. Peter Dixon, 51, a marketing manager from Oxfordshire, and his wife Gwenda, 52, were described by family as loving and compassionate individuals who had been enjoying a holiday walk along the coastal path. Their children later stated that the absence of their parents remained deeply painful even decades later. Public reaction included extensive appeals for information, large search operations, and long-term community anxiety regarding rural isolation and armed offenders. The forensic evidence established that all 4 victims died from close-range shotgun wounds, with ballistic, DNA, and property linkage demonstrating a consistent offender operating in the same geographic area across several years. Fiber and biological evidence confirmed direct contact between the suspect and at least 1 victim. However, for decades investigators lacked sufficient admissible evidence to charge a suspect, allowing the offender to remain at liberty. Only later advances in DNA recovery and ballistic re-examination connected preserved items to the murders. The unresolved procedural question remains. If modern forensic testing had been available earlier, could the linkage between the 1985 and 1989 killings have been established before additional crimes occurred? John William Cooper is currently serving life imprisonment following his 2011 convictions. Number 7. Stephen Farrow. On January 4, 2012, forensic pathologists examining the body of 77-year-old retired teacher Betty Yates documented a fatal stab wound to the neck accompanied by blunt force trauma to the head, injuries consistent with impact from a wooden walking stick recovered inside her cottage. This combination of sharp force and blunt force injury indicated a close-range assault within the residence, where investigators noted minimal disturbance and no clear evidence of forced entry. What investigators did not initially realize was that footwear impressions, DNA traces, and behavioral similarities would later connect this killing to a second homicide 6 weeks later, demonstrating a linked series involving a single offender, Stephen Farrow. Stephen Farrow, born in 1964, was described in court records as a transient individual with no fixed address who struggled to maintain stable employment and frequently lived in temporary accommodation. Psychiatric reports spanning many years documented persistent behavioral instability beginning in childhood, including hyperactivity, violent outbursts, and early arson involving a church altar at age 10. His criminal history included a 1994 conviction for aggravated burglary at the home of an elderly woman in Starbridge, during which he threatened violence with a knife. Court records also documented earlier appearances for theft, burglary, and deception offenses across multiple years. Several forensic psychiatrists diagnosed Farrow with psychopathic personality disorder, a condition associated with impaired empathy and persistent antisocial conduct. However, expert witnesses testified that despite this diagnosis, he retained the capacity to understand his actions and distinguish right from wrong. On January 4, 2012, police began a murder investigation after Betty Yates was found dead inside her riverside cottage in Bewdley. A post-mortem examination determined she died from a stab wound to the neck, with additional blunt force trauma indicating she had been struck with her own walking stick before the fatal injury. Investigative records documented that Yates, who lived alone but maintained an active social life, had likely been killed approximately 2 days earlier. The residence was described by a senior forensic investigator as generally very neat and tidy, suggesting the offender remained inside after the assault. Forensic pathologists recorded multiple injuries, penetrating knife wounds and localized cranial trauma, consistent with repeated impact from a cylindrical wooden object. Blood matching Yates was identified on the damaged walking stick, which had been placed back into a holder, indicating post-assault scene manipulation. Footwear evidence revealed impressions with a distinctive complex block pattern on an exercise mat. Forensic scientist Padraig O'Shea testified that the pattern was consistent in size and shape with boots later seized from Stephen Farrow, establishing a physical linkage between suspect and scene. The forensic turning point emerged when investigators compared evidence across locations. DNA analysis and footwear pattern comparison later demonstrated that the same offender had been present at multiple relevant scenes, indicating a consistent methodology involving entry into private residences and close-range stabbing. On February 14, 2012, builders discovered the body of Reverend John Suddeds, 59, lying on his back in the hallway of his vicarage in Thornbury. A post-mortem examination concluded he died from multiple stab wounds to the chest, abdomen, neck, and shoulder. One wound penetrated the spinal cord and would have been rapidly fatal without immediate medical intervention. Crime scene documentation recorded staged items placed around the body and evidence suggesting the victim had been attacked while lowered or restrained. 2 blood-stained kitchen knives were recovered, though forensic experts stated either could have been used due to similar dimensions. The official cause of death was listed as multiple stab wounds. Forensic analysis demonstrated that blood recovered from the sole of a walking boot seized from Farrow matched the DNA profile of Reverend Suddeds. Additional blood traces were identified on clothing items including overtrousers and a waterproof jacket. Laboratory testing revealed Farrow's DNA on the cap of an empty beer bottle found inside the vicarage, indicating he remained at the location after the fatal assault. CCTV footage placed him in Thornbury on February 13th, the day before the body was discovered. Investigative records document that police formally linked the 2 murders after identifying similarities in method, victim vulnerability, and geographic movement. Detective Chief Inspector Simon Crisp stated that tracking Farrow was difficult due to his nomadic lifestyle, but an anonymous phone call from a woman in Kent led directly to his location. Farrow was arrested in Folkestone on February 19, 2012, and during interviews he repeatedly answered no comment after being informed he was forensically linked to the crime scenes. Farrow was charged on February 22, 2012, with the murders of Betty Yates and Reverend John Suddeds, along with a burglary committed in Thornbury between December 21 and January 3. He pleaded not guilty to both murders but admitted the burglary and later admitted manslaughter for Suddeds on the grounds of diminished responsibility. During proceedings at Bristol Crown Court beginning October 4, prosecutors argued the killings were deliberate and controlled. Prosecutor Michael Fitton QC stated in court that Farrow was not insane and understood the difference between right and wrong. Expert psychiatric testimony confirmed the presence of psychopathic personality disorder but concluded it did not remove criminal responsibility. The jury unanimously convicted him of murdering Suddeds and, by an 11-1 majority, convicted him of the murder of Yates. On November 2, 2012, Mr. Justice Field imposed a whole-life tariff, meaning imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life without possibility of release. Later appeals, including a challenge before the European Court of Human Rights, were rejected, confirming the sentence would stand. Betty Yates, 77, was a retired teacher described by family as socially active and well-known within her community. Her children later stated it was important she be remembered for her life rather than the circumstances of her death. Reverend John Suddeds, 59, was a former lawyer who entered the clergy after a serious car accident and had moved to the Thornbury parish only months before his death. Parishioners and relatives established a memorial fund supporting community work and religious education initiatives. Family members publicly questioned whether earlier intervention for individuals with documented violent histories might prevent similar crimes. The forensic evidence established that both victims died from close-range sharp force injuries inside their residences, with DNA, blood, and footwear analysis directly linking Stephen Farrow to the scenes. The evidence also demonstrated that he remained within the properties after the assaults. What the evidence could not resolve was why prior convictions and psychiatric risk assessments did not result in sustained supervision before the 2012 killings. The procedural question remains whether earlier monitoring might have interrupted the escalation. Stephen Farrow is currently serving a whole life sentence in the United Kingdom with no possibility of release. If you're still watching, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crime Pioneer. Your support helps me bring you more true crime content. Number 8. Mark Philip Dixie. September 25, 2005, Croydon, South London, England. On the early morning of September 25, 2005, forensic pathologists examining the body of Sally and Bowman, 18, documented multiple stab wounds to the neck and abdomen, with associated biological evidence confirming a sexual assault that occurred while she was dead or dying. This combination of sharp force trauma and post-assault biological findings immediately indicated a controlled, close-range attack outside the victim's own home, where personal items, including her handbag and phone, were missing. What investigators did not initially realize was that DNA recovered from the body, a bloody fingerprint, and patterned bite mark injuries would later contradict early assumptions about other suspects and instead identify a single offender, Mark Philip Dixie. Mark Philip Dixie was born on September 24, 1970, in Streatham, South London. Court records documented a disrupted childhood, including his parents' separation during infancy and later family changes after his mother remarried. As an adult, he worked intermittently in service jobs, eventually gaining employment as a chef at the Ye Olde Six Bells in Horley, Surrey. His criminal record began in 1986 and included convictions between 1986 and 1990 for robbery, burglary, assaulting a police officer, indecent assault, indecent exposure, and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. Police documentation later described a persistent pattern of sexual offending across multiple jurisdictions. Dixie lived in Australia from January 1993 until April 1999, when he was deported following an indecent exposure offense. Psychological assessments referenced during proceedings noted long-term substance misuse beginning in adolescence, including cannabis, cocaine, and ecstasy, combined with escalating sexually motivated behavior. Sally and Bowman, born September 11, 1987, was an aspiring model who had recently joined Pulse Model Management in January 2005 and studied at the Brit School for Performing Arts and Technology. Family statements described her as ambitious, confident, and focused on a career in fashion. On the night of September 24 to 25, 2005, Bowman returned to Croydon after an evening out. According to court testimony, her boyfriend Lewis Sproston drove her home at approximately 4 o'clock British Summer Time, and the couple argued while sitting outside her house. He later left, reporting that he saw her walking toward the driveway. At approximately 4:20 British Summer Time, neighbors reported hearing screams. More than 2 hours later, Bowman's body was discovered in the driveway near her home. This delay reduced the opportunity for immediate preservation of transient evidence such as footwear impressions and environmental trace material. Forensic pathologists documented multiple penetrating knife wounds to the neck and stomach. In forensic terminology, penetrating wounds indicate a sharp-edged weapon entering body tissue with sufficient force to damage internal structures. The injuries were consistent with repeated close-range stabbing. Biological examination confirmed sexual assault, and investigators recorded that the victim's handbag, cardigan, bra, thong, and mobile phone were missing, indicating robbery alongside the homicide. Additional evidence included a bloody fingerprint on her shoe and patterned bite marks on her body, which forensic odontologists used to compare dental characteristics. The evidence-based contradiction emerged early in the inquiry. Police initially treated Sproston as a suspect because he was the last known person to see Bowman alive and admitted the argument. However, DNA analysis eliminated him within hours, demonstrating he was not the attacker. Forensic pattern analysis then focused on 3 key evidence types. First, DNA recovered from the victim. Second, the bloody fingerprint. Third, bite mark comparison. Together, these findings indicated a single male offender who had direct physical contact during and after the assault. Dixie later claimed he had spent the night drinking and taking drugs, encountered the body after another unknown offender had killed Bowman, and then had sexual contact with her. Forensic sequencing of injuries contradicted this explanation because the stab wounds and biological evidence indicated the same individual inflicted the fatal injuries and remained at the scene. Investigative records document that the case generated extensive public attention and thousands of leads. Forensic analysis demonstrated that DNA recovered from Bowman's body matched a profile obtained after Dixie was arrested on June 10, 2006, following a separate incident involving a fight during a World Cup match in Crawley, West Sussex. Laboratory testing also linked Dixie's DNA to an earlier sexual offense in 2001 involving indecent exposure in a telephone booth. Detective Superintendent Stuart Cundy, who led the investigation, stated that a comprehensive national DNA register could have identified the offender within 24 hours rather than the 9 months required. Evidence logs confirmed additional linkage through the bloody fingerprint recovered at the scene and bite mark comparisons consistent with Dixie's dental pattern. Investigators also examined his history in Australia, where an alleged 1998 attack involving stabbing and rape produced biological evidence later matched to him, although no formal charge followed. Dixie was charged with the murder of Sally and Bowman and related sexual offenses. Under English law, murder requires proof that the defendant unlawfully killed with intent to cause death or serious injury. The prosecution presented DNA evidence, fingerprint analysis, and forensic pathology findings demonstrating a continuous sequence of assault. At the Old Bailey on February 22, 2008, a jury of 7 women and 5 men returned a unanimous guilty verdict after approximately 2 days of deliberation. Prosecutor Brian Altman QC told the court that Dixie's claim he encountered the body after death was inconsistent with the forensic sequence of injuries. On February 25, 2008, the court imposed life imprisonment with a recommended minimum term of 34 years, one of the longest minimum terms for a single victim murder. Judge Gerald Gordon stated the conduct was so severe he would not repeat the details in open court. A later appeal was dismissed in February 2009 as entirely without merit, confirming the conviction. Sally Ann Bowman, 18, was described by family as an ambitious young woman pursuing a modeling career, with recent participation in Alternative Fashion Week. Her father stated she would forever be missed, while her mother said the loss would never heal. Community response included public appeals, extensive media coverage, and a memorial held on September 11, 2008, marking what would have been her 21st birthday in central Croydon. Family members expressed concern that delays in DNA identification prolonged the investigation. The forensic evidence established that Sally and Bowman died from multiple stab wounds inflicted at close range and that DNA, fingerprint, and bite mark analysis directly linked Mark Dixie to the assault. The evidence also demonstrated post-attack sexual contact consistent with the same offender. What the evidence could not change was the initial delay caused by the absence of a comprehensive DNA register, which investigators stated might have identified the suspect within hours. The procedural question remains whether earlier database coverage could have prevented months of uncertainty. Mark Philip Dixie is currently serving life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years following his 2008 conviction. If you're still watching, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Crime Pioneer. Your support helps me bring you more true crime content. Number 9. Mario Soler. On November 26, 2001, forensic examiners reviewing the death of Cassandra McDermott, 19, documented extensive blunt force trauma consistent with repeated punches that rendered her unconscious, followed by airway obstruction after she choked on her own vomit while left unattended. This combination of non-weapon blunt force injury and positional asphyxia, where breathing becomes obstructed due to body position, indicated a fatal sequence that could potentially have been prevented with timely medical assistance. What investigators did not initially realize was that later witness testimony, a second violent assault, and new admissions would contradict the original acquittal and ultimately establish that a single offender, Mario Soler, had caused her death. Mario Soler, born 1978, lived in South London and was described in court records as a former semi-professional footballer and later a builder. Investigative files indicated he maintained relationships with several young women in the same geographic area, often meeting them through social and local networks. His criminal history included a serious sexual offense at age 15, for which he received a 4-year custodial sentence. Court documentation and family testimony later described a continuing pattern of violence toward partners. including repeated physical assaults during relationships. Psychological characterizations presented during proceedings described llers as controlling and narcissistic, with a documented tendency toward coercive behavior in intimate relationships. Judge Paul Worsley QC later stated in sentencing remarks that he represented a very real and continuing danger to young women who trusted him. Cassandra McDermott, 19, lived in Norbury and was described by relatives as confident and independent, someone who would stand up for herself. Family members later established a domestic abuse charity in her memory following the case. On November 26, 2001, inside her mother's house in Granville Gardens, Norbury, an argument occurred between McDermott and her former boyfriend Mario llers. According to later admissions presented in court, llers punched her with sufficient force to render her unconscious. Forensic analysis of injuries indicated blunt force trauma consistent with repeated impacts to the head against a hard surface, a mechanism capable of causing immediate loss of consciousness through rapid acceleration of the brain within the skull. Evidence presented by prosecutors stated that after she collapsed, llers covered her with bedding and left the property. Without assistance, McDermott subsequently experienced airway obstruction after vomit entered her airway, a condition known in forensic pathology as aspiration leading to asphyxia. The evidence-based contradiction emerged during the original 2002 trial. llers claimed he had left her alive and well minutes before her death. However, later expert testimony indicated that the severity of head trauma would likely have left her incapable of self-recovery without immediate medical aid. The official cause of death was recorded as complications following blunt force assault, with choking identified as the final mechanism. Investigators noted that no emergency services were contacted, eliminating the possibility of life-saving intervention. The case remained unresolved after a jury acquitted llers of murder and manslaughter in November 2002, leaving the death legally unproven despite ongoing suspicion recorded in investigative files. In February 2007, a second violent incident occurred involving another former partner, Cara Hoyt, 19, at a flat in Walthamstow. Medical reports documented severe head injuries after she was struck repeatedly with a hammer, resulting in skull fractures, brain trauma, and long-term neurological impairment. Investigators later identified significant behavioral parallels between the two incidents: intimate partner context, sudden escalation during confrontation, and the use of sustained blunt force violence inside a private residence. Together, these patterns suggested a consistent offender methodology. Following the 2007 attack, investigative records document that Hoyt, initially unable to speak due to brain injury, identified llers as her attacker using written prompts and gestures from her hospital bed. Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola later described her determination to provide evidence as astonishing. During subsequent interviews, detectives learned that llers had previously admitted responsibility for McDermott's death to Hoyt after she discovered documents relating to his earlier acquittal. This disclosure was treated as new and compelling evidence. Police formally reopened the 2001 homicide investigation, applying revised legal provisions that allowed retrial when significant new evidence emerged. Investigators also reviewed prior domestic violence reports and historical witness statements describing repeated assaults during McDermott's relationship with llers. Evidence logs confirmed that similarities between both attacks, victim profile, method of assault, and escalation pattern, supported a single offender theory. Prosecutor Simon Dennison QC stated that the new admissions and corroborating testimony fundamentally altered the evidentiary position. In the original 2002 proceedings at the Old Bailey, a jury acquitted llers of both murder and manslaughter after less than 3 hours of deliberation, accepting his claim that he left McDermott alive. After the double jeopardy rule was revised in 2005, allowing retrial where new and compelling evidence exists, the Crown applied to quash the acquittal. The Court of Appeal approved a retrial based on fresh testimony and admissions. At the subsequent trial, llers eventually admitted responsibility for McDermott's death and pleaded guilty to manslaughter, while also facing charges for the attempted murder of Cara Hoyt. The court imposed life sentences on July 3, 2009, including a minimum term of 23 years. Judge Paul Worsley stated that both victims had trusted him in their homes and that his conduct demonstrated ongoing danger. The ruling made Llers the first person in the United Kingdom convicted of an offense for which a jury had previously cleared him. Cassandra McDermott's family described a prolonged struggle for justice lasting more than 7 years, stating the original acquittal left them feeling the truth had not been recognized. Her mother later created a domestic abuse support initiative in her memory. Kara Hoyt survived the 2007 attack but sustained permanent neurological injury, including partial paralysis and aphasia, a language disorder affecting speech production. Despite these impairments, she provided crucial testimony that enabled the case to be reopened. Families from both cases publicly stated that earlier intervention after the first assault might have prevented the second attack. The forensic evidence established that Cassandra McDermott died following blunt force assault leading to unconsciousness and fatal airway obstruction, while later testimony and admissions linked Mario Llers directly to the sequence of events. Pattern analysis across 2 incidents demonstrated consistent intimate partner violence escalating to life-threatening injury. What the evidence initially failed to achieve was a conviction, allowing the offender to remain free until new testimony emerged years later. The procedural question remains whether earlier recognition of coercive control patterns and prior violence could have prevented the second near-fatal assault. Mario Llers is currently serving life imprisonment with a minimum term of 23 years following his 2009 sentencing. Number 10. David Gilroy. On the morning of May 4, 2010, investigators reviewing the disappearance of Suzanne Pilley, 38, documented a sudden and complete cessation of her routine digital activity. No phone use, no banking, and no workplace arrival. An abrupt pattern forensic analysts recognize as consistent with an unexpected external interruption. This anomaly became critical because her final movements were captured on multiple CCTV systems, establishing a precise timeline that ended only meters from her office entrance on Thistle Street. What investigators did not initially realize was that a combination of surveillance data, injury documentation, and vehicle movement analysis would later support a murder conviction despite the absence of a body. David Gilroy, born 1963, lived in Edinburgh and worked at Infrastructure Managers Ltd, where Suzanne Pilley was employed as a bookkeeper. Court records described him as a married man who had been involved in a turbulent, on-off relationship with Pilley for approximately a year. Evidence presented at trial indicated increasingly frequent contact in the weeks before her disappearance, including hundreds of text messages and voicemails. Witnesses stated the relationship had become strained as Pilley attempted to end it and had recently begun seeing another man. Suzanne Pilley, 38, was described by family and colleagues as reliable and routine-oriented, someone who consistently followed the same commute and work schedule. Her employers later stated that failing to arrive at her desk without explanation was completely out of character, a behavioral deviation investigators treated as significant. On May 4, 2010, Pilley traveled toward her workplace in central Edinburgh. CCTV recorded her routine stop at the St. Andrews Square Sainsbury's branch, where she was seen leaving at 8:51 a.m. At 8:54 a.m., additional CCTV captured her on North St. David Street, approximately 20 meters from the entrance to Thistle Street. Forensic imagery specialist Jacqueline Butterwick testified that image comparison confirmed the figure was definitively Pilley. This became the final verified public sighting. When she failed to report for work, her parents, Robert and Sylvia Pilley, reported her missing later that afternoon. Within days, investigators noted a complete absence of financial transactions, phone usage, or contact with friends, behavioral indicators consistent with sudden incapacitation. Prosecutors later alleged that Gilroy killed Pilley inside the Infrastructure Managers Ltd premises, possibly in the basement area. The exact method of killing remained unknown, reflected in the indictment wording, by means to the prosecutor unknown, a legal phrasing used when cause cannot be forensically determined. Specialist cadaver dogs trained to detect human remains identified 3 areas of interest, 1 within the basement and 2 in the boot of Gilroy's silver Vauxhall Vectra. Such dogs are conditioned to detect decomposition compounds associated with blood or tissue. A forensic contradiction emerged when laboratory scientist Kirsty McTurk testified that no DNA belonging to Pili was recovered from either the workplace or the vehicle. However, she also reported a fresh odor in the boot consistent with either air freshener or a cleansing agent, suggesting potential evidence removal. Further analysis focused on Gilroy's movements on May 5, 2010, when he drove toward Argyll. CCTV reconstruction demonstrated that his journey took approximately 2 hours longer than the average travel time each way, and fuel comparisons indicated 124 miles of travel could not be accounted for. Mechanical examination of the vehicle later documented suspension damage, scrape marks beneath the chassis, and vegetation attached to the car, physical indicators consistent with off-road driving on rough terrain. Medical testimony from Dr. Nathaniel Carey documented scratches on Gilroy's hands, wrists, and forearms, along with a cut on his forehead and bruising to his chest. He stated the injuries could be consistent with fingernail marks from a struggle, though he acknowledged they might also originate from non-violent activities such as gardening. The official prosecutorial position concluded that Pili's life showed a sudden interruption, including untouched bank accounts, no care arrangements for her pets, and immediate cessation of communication. Behavioral evidence often used to infer death when a body is absent. Lothian and Borders police launched a high-profile appeal on May 11, 2010, deploying digital screens across Edinburgh displaying Pili's last known movements. By May 19, the inquiry was formally reclassified as a murder investigation. Investigative records show officers reconstructed Gilroy's vehicle route using extensive CCTV from urban streets, petrol stations, and rural roads. Analysts compared his travel duration with standard route timings, concluding his detours were inconsistent with routine travel. Phone record analysis demonstrated frequent daily contact between Gilroy and Pili that abruptly ceased the day before her disappearance. A pattern prosecutors argued indicated prior knowledge of her death. Investigators also recovered evidence suggesting attempts to access her email account. On June 23, 2010, Gilroy was detained under Section 14 of the Criminal Procedure, Scotland, Act 1995, and later charged with murder and attempting to defeat the ends of justice. During an earlier 11-hour police interview on May 6, officers had already documented visible injuries on his face and hands. The trial began on February 20, 2012, at the High Court of Justiciary with Lord Brackadale presiding. The prosecution, led by Alex Prentice QC, presented a wholly circumstantial case, meaning no single piece of evidence proved the crime, but the combined facts were argued to demonstrate guilt. The Crown alleged Gilroy killed Pili in the workplace basement, concealed her body, transported it in his car, and disposed of it in a remote area of Argyll. The defense, led by Jack Davidson QC, argued it was unsafe to convict without direct forensic proof. After 24 days of evidence, a jury of 8 men and 7 women deliberated for 2.5 days. On March 15, 2012, Gilroy was found guilty by majority verdict of murder and attempting to defeat the ends of justice. On April 18, 2012, Lord Brackadale sentenced him to life imprisonment with a punishment part of 18 years, stating that only Gilroy knew the location of the body. An appeal lodged later that year was rejected on December 20, 2012. Suzanne Pili's family stated the conviction brought partial relief but not closure, emphasizing that the absence of her remains prevented traditional grieving. Her father said the verdict lifted a heavy load, while relatives continued to seek information about her location. Colleagues and friends participated in extensive search efforts during the investigation, and public appeals generated widespread community involvement. The case became one of the most prominent Scottish prosecutions conducted without recovery of a body. The cumulative evidence established a precise last-seen timeline, suspicious vehicle movements, injury patterns consistent with a struggle, and behavioral indicators showing a sudden end to Suzanne Pili's normal life. Together, these circumstantial elements supported the jury's conclusion that David Gilroy caused her death and concealed the body. What the evidence could not provide was a confirmed cause of death or the recovery of physical remains, leaving the exact mechanism and location unresolved. The enduring question remains whether future information or discovery of the burial site could finally supply the forensic certainty that the case still lacks. David Gilroy is serving a life sentence, and Suzanne Pilley's body has never been found. We've covered some of the most evil British male serial killers who terrorized the nation. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to my channel. Which case shocked you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Crime Pioneer, and I'll see you in the next video.